Well, we're going to begin here. Class number 4 in church history. It's 9 a.m. I want to use as much of our time today as we can. There's lots of material on today's subject, so let's get to it as soon as we can. A bit of description. This morning we're looking at Anabaptists and the Anabaptist movement. And as we're going to find today, that is very broad in its description. There's a lot in terms of what doctrinally was believed by this movement and how this movement also grew into something far beyond what would actually be described as doctrinal. So there's lots to talk about this morning, and I want to get into it. But a bit of a description of the Anabaptist movement is it's been known for some of the events that took place as the radical Reformation. And you're going to find exactly why it was called that, especially as we get near the end of today's class, talking about what was known as the Munster Rebellion. So let's get into things, and we'll begin with a word of prayer here, and then we can start looking at our material. So let's bow our heads. Father, we thank you this morning again for the sweetness of being in your house with your people and talking about your works through history. And today, Lord, as we discuss these things in this movement, we just pray that you would open our minds to these things, help us to be again challenged by history, challenged in ways to consider the many faults that we see, the many opportunities for error, the tightness that we must have as the people of God to what your word teaches. And so help us, give us wisdom, give me clarity as we talk about these things, and may you be praised with our time. In Jesus' name, amen. So, again, class number 4, Anabaptists. This morning we've talked about in the first 3 classes, Roman Catholicism, the papacy, the tyranny of the papacy, and the introduction that gave to the German Reformation, now sweeping across that land, the Protestant Reformation. And we looked at Luther, we looked at his theology, we looked at Ulrich Zwingli and the Swiss Reformation last week. And so today we'll see some of the connection from that Swiss Reformation in what was known as the Anabaptist movement, what we're talking about today. Very unique. There's some positives. There's some really painful aspects that come about from this Swiss Reformation. Some things that I think many who are Protestants and evangelical Christians kind of want to skip over a little bit, but nonetheless, this is here. There's good things, there's bad things. And I want to recognize, even at the outset, as I've studied this throughout the week, just how uniquely difficult, in a way, it is to pin down exactly all the different, branches of Anabaptism from its early beginning. And that's partly because to be an Anabaptist in the 16th century meant that you had a very short lifespan. You were lucky if you were going to live 3 years beyond when you essentially asserted yourself as Anabaptist in conviction. Anabaptists were persecuted greatly. They were a hunted people. And as a result of that, and we'll talk about the basis for that in a moment, but as a result, we just don't have a ton of documentation on Anabaptism and what were some of the core beliefs. We do have some. So we're going to talk about that this morning, but it's very hard to pin down the entirety of this movement because they themselves didn't really have the opportunity. In maybe some small spheres they did, but generally speaking, especially those who were more orthodox, it was very difficult for them to come together and craft what they did believe. And so we don't have a whole lot. We know some of the names. We know a little bit of the movements of Anabaptism in this Swiss German region mainly. But it's difficult, especially for those who are looking at the original sources, to pin down every absolute detail as much as we do for men like Ulrich Zwingli or Martin Luther. There's lots more writing surrounding that. So that's just a little bit of a beginning note. And again, I emphasize there's some genuineness here and then some outright cult-like behavior that we're going to talk about. And the name Anabaptist, as they're known, means to rebaptize. So if you are called an Anabaptist, it just means you're a rebaptizer. And that's not entirely accurate about what the early Anabaptists actually believed. They didn't believe that someone should just be rebaptized. Some did, as the movement kind of went leftward. But what they really believed was that infant baptism wasn't a valid form of baptism, which we would agree with in some senses here. And so Anabaptist really, even as it describes the mode and the impetus for baptism for Anabaptists, just still doesn't cover what Anabaptists really believe. That's just one tiny aspect. But it contains something of the opposition by the culture as something of a word that was derogatory for them. And again, we're going to get to why that would be a derogatory term for Anabaptists in a moment. Where did they come from? Well, Anabaptism came about in Switzerland, which, if you remember last class, we talked about Ulrich Zwingli and the Reformation in Switzerland. And during Ulrich Zwingli's beginning of his ministry, he had a group of disciples, we could call them, men that he would meet on a regular basis that would discuss the Greek text, the Hebrew text of the Bible. We know Zwingli was an incredible Greek scholar, memorizing, as we talked about last week, Paul's epistles. And he had a group of men that he would meet with, and they would discuss, and they would go into the depth of the scriptures and analyze various topics. I know Martin Luther had something similar in his table talks in his home. Ulrich was a very scholarly, and among those group of men, there was writings that contained early discussions about addressing infant baptism. Because last week we talked about Ulrich Zwingli's conviction, rightly, of the authority of the scriptures determining the practice of worship. So for Ulrich Zwingli, essentially, at least in writing, nothing was to be done in worship and practice that was not prescribed in Scripture. And we, as we follow that Reformed Protestant tradition, I'd hope we could bow our head or nod our heads on that and say, absolutely. That would be later crafted and sort of better articulated by John Calvin in what would be known as the regulative principle. But that sort of gave rise to conversation about, well, where then does infant baptism fit in? Because we don't have a New Testament basis describing, some of our Presbyterian brothers and sisters would differ here, but we don't have a New Testament basis that really gives us an impetus for infants just being baptized because they're infants born into the church. We have an impetus, as these men and Zwingli would uncover, for believers' baptism, baptism of those who profess to know Christ. And so these men in their discussions would become really upset by this, and Zwingli, at least in his initial writings, would sort of give opportunity to this line of discussion, saying, yeah, I can see essentially the reasoning here. But Zwingli would eventually later move away from that, and this group of New Testament scholars, Greek scholars, would continue to push this. They would continue to advocate for this and even go over into a form of total separation from any relation to civil protections, civil magistrates, and any involvement at all in the political realm. We're going to uncover that a little bit, so hang on. Among these notable men in the beginning of the movement, some connected more closely with Ulrich Zwingli and others not. We have the names Conrad Grebel, Felix Manz. Felix Manz is going to die by drowning in what would be known as his third baptism. Felix Manz and George Blaurock. These are some of the biggest names at the beginnings of Anabaptism. They were, again, these men especially, being around Ulrich Zwingli, convinced that the Reformation was just not moving fast enough. So Ulrich Zwingli was doing a lot of work, but to them, no, we're not pushing this as far as we need to go. We need to be consistent. We need to continue to move forward. And Ulrich Zwingli was not convinced of that. They thought that the church should not be connected with the civil government. They seen at that time, and this would be crafted and uncovered later in John Calvin, and we're going to talk about that later. But they seen this blend of the church and the state in the Roman Catholic oversight, the papacy's oversight of the monarchy, and the blend of civil governments that dictated the discipline of the church and enacted justice upon whether it's heretics or others who disagreed with various convictions. And so they were pushing, look, this needs to go forward. And baptism, as they thought, was a right for believers only. And so Zwingli, as I mentioned, was initially supportive, but would later come to outright reject their teachings and convictions. And I think in some of my studies that I found this week that Zwingli's counter-argument to these men about baptism would be formulative in John Calvin's later expansion of a covenant basis for children's baptism. Because John Calvin, being very reformed, incredible theologian for Protestant history, would still believe in infant baptism. And I think partly because of how Zwingli, in counter-arguing with these men, would make a covenantal basis that John Calvin would later expand upon. Zwingli was not supportive, and these men and a rising group of Anabaptists who believed the similar convictions, who continued to advocate for the ending of such practices as unbiblical, would end up meeting in Zurich, where Zwingli was pushing along the Swiss Reformation, getting much support. They would meet with the Council of Governance there in Zurich and with Zwingli, and had an opportunity to present their views, and would condemn the current practice of infant baptism as antithetical to the Christian gospel. But at the outset of that debate, Zwingli and the council would oppose Anabaptists. They would oppose what they were teaching as unbiblical, and they would essentially be commanded to cease their convictions, cease their practices by means of law, and by means of, as we'll see later, pain of death. So I think initially, as we talk about that, some of us go, well, we can kind of sympathize with these men, and we can. I think these are sort of early risings of what we would know as believers' baptism being formulated. But what we're going to see is Anabaptists didn't really just have that as a view. I think they seen the errors, but in my mind, swung too far in the opposite direction. And there's a lot to talk about here, so we'll get into it. These men and others would begin to found a secret congregation known as the Brethren. So they didn't call themselves Anabaptists. They would call themselves the Brethren. They believed themselves to be consistent with Scripture, and they carried out their convictions despite the consequences. One other thing to mention is Anabaptists were thoroughly, at this point, pacifistic. So they were pacifists. They did not believe in fighting back against the authorities of government. They believed in, some believed in a total divorce of any civil governance whatsoever. In fact, a total separation, that there's truth in a separation of the church from society as a called out people, but they push that farther as a communal society that must be geographically distinct and unconnected from all forms of civil discourse or market, trade even, and society, and definitely governance or military. So these would kind of branch out. There are various forms of their convictions here. George Blaurock, I mentioned his name, a former priest. At this point, this was January 21st, 1525, right at the outset of the Council of Zurich declaring them to cease their practice. George Blaurock would ask Conrad Grebel to baptize him. So they were just going ahead with it regardless of what was commanded of them. Him and others would be baptized at the city square, and the group would continue to meet quietly, baptizing one another, studying the Bible, taking the Lord's Supper in private, but they were immediately opposed. The laws came into effect right away, with many being placed in prison. Many were burned to death, and often in Zurich, they were drowned. And Felix Manz, I believe, was the first one as it was known as his third baptism, would be drowned publicly, as would many other Anabaptists following him. And you would get much more official opposition against Anabaptists by 1528, when Charles V would order them to be put to death. All Anabaptists to be opposed and put to death. Even 1529 at the Diet of Speyer, if you remember, this was the place where Protestants were pushing back against Roman Catholicism that sought to undo the conclusions of the Diet of Worms against Martin Luther. Well, it was actually a contentious issue at that diet, and Protestants even, along with Catholics, opposed Anabaptism, and it was declared at that point to be a great contentious issue that needed to be opposed, even if it meant they were killed. The other question that's probably in your minds as we talk about this morning is, why such opposition? Okay, they're, in our minds, originally, or at least initially, we're thinking they're just baptizing one another. They're not really causing a big fuss. They have their own congregation. What's the big deal, right? They're essentially Baptists in some form, be it that they have some extreme views on governance and separation of the church. And I think you could summarize what was understood by their convictions as treasonous at that time. And let me explain that. At that time, the entire, essentially, European world was a sacralist society, which again meant that the magistrate, civil ordinances, civil structure, society was blended with the church, in that essentially your entrance into society as a tax-abiding citizen, as a product of the state, was baptism. So essentially, to be a citizen, to have rights of citizenship, to enter into culture, you were entering into that society by means of your baptism. The church and state were a combined institution. The civil government operated in conjunction with that of magisterial powers. That's called sacralism. I'm not sure if I called it that. Sacralism. And the separation of the two would be a view to gain further traction later under John Calvin and others, but it wasn't yet. So your rights, like I said, and your identity as a citizen were acquired by means of your baptism. Tax rolls in European countries were based upon this. And so when the Anabaptists rejected infant baptism, they were attacking the very social order of society. What they were asking to do, essentially, of the church and civil magistrate and all of the functions that kept life together, as it were, at that time, was to undo it all. They were fighting the very fabric of their culture. They were fighting the very fabric of the church. They were fighting against the fabric of the magistrate and the monarchy. They were advocating for a total renewal of society, which made them essentially men and women going after the state. I guess liable of treason. Anarchists in some way. Yeah, anarchists in some way. Sedition. Insurrectionists, you might put it. And I think the other aspect of what really formulated that too is you have at that time neighboring Turks that are seeking to invade European states. And as a result, many even Reformed Protestants and Roman Catholics were coming together to fight the onslaught of the Turks who were coming in to invade. And you had Anabaptists who at that time, when civil powers are trying to unite the peoples to come against the onslaught of opposition in the Turks, Anabaptists are advocating for, no, we don't fight. We will not fight the Turks. We will back off. We will let them invade. In fact, we need to reorient the entire way that we're thinking about society and break down every system. And we do not support fighting back this invasion. And so you can see why it would make Anabaptists essentially an enemy of all peoples, an enemy of the Reformers, an enemy of the Roman Catholic Church, an enemy of society, peasants, the livelihoods of many. They looked at Anabaptists and saying, look, you are destroying everything that we stand upon. And even for the reformers, at least at this time, they still believe, like Luther and Zwingli, that there should be a coordination between the state and the church, an intermingling that allows the state to protect the church and the church to invest in the state. We will craft that, and even today my sermon is going to talk a little bit about that. But Anabaptists sought to destroy this. They believed that the church, in some sense, right, we know this to be true, needed to be separated from the control of state powers, but needed to be utterly disconnected in every area, distinct from the civil community, and that connection was infant baptism. So if you take out infant baptism, you destroy the social fabric of society. And that's, I think, why Zwingli just knew he couldn't advocate for that. He couldn't push for it, because he knew that, look, if we drive this scriptural assertion to its ultimate conclusions, it's never going to work. We can never reorder the monarchy, the state. We can't reorder absolutely everything in this way. It's too tightly knit. It's never going to work. And so these men and women were essentially labeled disturbers of the peace of society. Their advocation for totally breaking free of the structures currently held civilization together made them an enemies. And so Catholics and Reformers were on the same side of their opposition, and they're very hard opposition. It's sometimes difficult to reconcile in your mind as you consider some of the early Reformers' deep support of the persecution of what many of these would be. These are true believers. And they would meet, in some cases, a torturous demise as a result of their beliefs. And I'm sure there are lessons for us that are found in that. But everyone was essentially against them. So that's a bit about their persecution. So many died. Many very tragic stories, especially these early Anabaptists who really belonged to more of a scholarly Anabaptism. In some sense, far more of a biblically rooted Anabaptist conviction. It would grow a little bit different as time went on. So I want to talk about that now. Despite widespread and gruesome persecution, the movement expanded. There's some names here, and I want to talk a little bit about Anabaptist growth. By 1526, so we're going back a little bit before there was even more formalized persecution, there was an Anabaptist assembly in Augsburg under the leadership of a man, and this is a notable figure, Hans Denk. He would baptize a man named Hans Hut in 1526, and note that name, Hut. One of the most zealous missionaries in that early Anabaptist movement. He founded the Anabaptist churches all over Austria and prompted communal Anabaptism in Moravia. So that again pushes the Anabaptist communal society of total separation from civil realms and interaction with governance and any military support or involvement. And this is where we come to the very important leader, Jacob Hutter. I wouldn't be pronouncing it by their name there, but Jacob Hutter, and that's where you get the name Hutterites, and we know their locations around us, even here in Calgary. He was involved in rescuing Anabaptists to the safety of Moravia. So you have a few names that relate to the Hutterites there as later Anabaptists coming from these men and their communal societies. Anabaptism spread, but due to its widespread travel and pressure from persecution, its foundation became harder and harder to define. So Anabaptists at these later periods, once some of the earlier Anabaptists are dying off and their scholarly original men are gone, it becomes a little more difficult to define exactly what they believe. And you have many sects of Anabaptists that were egalitarian, which mean sort of gave men and women equal roles in terms of the church. And so it changed a bit of the understanding of the leadership of men in church offices. They were very pacifist, some being far more and some being far less. There were some anti-Reformation doctrines, some that really opposed predestination and other soteriological elements really refined by Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli. And many of them became more and more isolationist. So as that conviction about involvement with the civil realm and the magistrate and the separation of church and society grew, you had some that essentially believed, well, that Christians, to be faithful, must live in a communal society, share their resources, and not experience the same involvement with the rest of the world, because that would be intermixing with the devil. So you have some things that are a little bit going far. And so some of the leaders that still remained to curb some of the extremism met in Schleitheim, Switzerland, in 1527 to issue what was known as the Confession of Schleitheim. It was 2 years after Anabaptism begun. So Anabaptism really spread in its early periods. Despite persecution, it really could not stop the movement. It spread all over the Netherlands and Germany and Switzerland and beyond. And so these men come and they draft essentially their confession about what are the core beliefs of Anabaptism. And I'm just going to summarize some of those segments. The initial portion was devoted to the proper administration of baptism, being not for infants, but those who profess faith. There's a basis in the secondary points for banning from communion. So essentially warnings that would be given to those that would be withheld from the communion table as a matter of church discipline. Again, remember that's important for them, especially as they seek to separate from the discipline that previously belonged to the state over church matters. So the state and the governance of society came in and exercised that discipline that was originally found in the Roman Catholic Church. Here we have note that the aspects of discipline belong to the church alone, which again, we would agree with that. There's more points about the qualifications for communion, and then they have the bigger points on the separation of believers from all of those not united with God in Christ. And that's where you really get elaboration on the movement away from society and into their own communal realms. And they go on to talk about the rejection of the use of the sword and taking oaths as well. So they're essentially, Anabaptism refused to be involved in the military, refused to ever be involved in any form of opposition to state powers. They are pacifists by confession. And they are only more hated as a result of this, as a combination, what is understood by the rest of both Catholics and Protestants as of heretics and those guilty of sedition, those coming against the civil powers, coming against with their treasonous ideas against the state when we need their support against the oncoming Turks. They are hated by society as those who are essentially insurrectionists. Now, here's where we get into some of the more radical stuff. So this is where they're known, their movement is known as the Radical Reformation, essentially. And if you know anything about this, you know this is real crazy stuff. Basically had nightmares about it this week, just studying it. Some of it is really, really awful. And others of it just, obviously went off into some of the cultish practices. But the Anabaptist movement would become increasingly radical as many of the original scholars were killed. So essentially going from that earlier pacifism to rejecting that in some places and in some movements outright, as unrest and resentment would take over because they just wouldn't want to take it anymore. And new revolutionary ideas would take place in some of these more radical Anabaptists. And I think a lot of that was connected with the earlier peasant rebellions. Some of the peasant rebellions that even Martin Luther spoke into and then would later speak against and encourage civil magistrates to come and to stop the peasant revolution, even by means of just killing them. Martin Luther would not be very favored in some regions of Germany as a result of his advocating for that. But you have rising tensions amongst the peasants and the injustices afflicted upon them that again would sort of intermingle with the Anabaptist movement, a movement that really wasn't defined very well in their convictions. And so what happens with Christian movements that aren't typically found in their convictions? Well, they attract some weirdos. And that's exactly what Anabaptism did at this time. Really attracted some very, very, very odd characters. And one of the earliest advocates here, as we begin to plunge into some interesting things, was Thomas Müntzer. He would be executed in 1525 after joining a revolt, a physical revolt, so not necessarily recognizing some of the earlier Anabaptist convictions. Another more prominent name is Melchior Hoffman. He was first a Lutheran, and then a Zwinglian, and then became an Anabaptist. And he spread Anabaptism to the Netherlands quite successfully, but would come back to Strasbourg on the basis of what he believed prophetically to be the day of the Lord's arriving. So here's a man who's getting really interested in eschatology and end times and believes that he has a prophetic voice into the coming of the Lord, Jesus' return. Things are coming to the end, and this man believes that that's going to take place in Strasbourg, and that his imprisonment would set those events in motion. So he comes back to Strasbourg as sort of a pacifist, but beginning to reject that, because he taught that once I get to Strasbourg, once I've imprisoned, that a time is going to come when it's going to be necessary to oppose the children of darkness. So here's where that talk about really separation for an Anabaptist from the civil society as evil becomes more of a violent force. So for him, he's saying, no, we're going to have to take up arms and actually oppose. And as a result of his influence, many people actually flock to Strasbourg, thinking that this is where the day of the Lord's going to come, because he's actually arrested. So the first aspect of his quote-unquote prophecy actually takes place. He's put in jail, and it triggers all these people that hear about this. And remember, the printing press is very active. In Munster, there was actually an Anabaptist later who was going to distribute, because he owns the printing press, distribute many tracts. There's very good writing in the Anabaptist movement to support people coming to Strasbourg, and then coming. We'll talk about it to Munster as well. So many people flock, but they are opposed by the authorities. This triggers mass opposition here, and the movement of Anabaptism in Strasbourg is opposed. And years later, 10 years later, actually, Hoffman essentially rots in prison and dies. So clearly, this is a false prophecy. But visionaries and revolution is going to continue in the Anabaptist movement here in this region. Other notable voices from the Netherlands announced, no, he wasn't right. It's the city of Munster that's the real location for the day of the Lord. And so, I think that's really based upon a large degrees of tolerance that were being built up in the city of Munster, because Anabaptists were gaining traction. As the Reformers gained traction, there was a lot more openness for convictions in this area. So Anabaptists had a lot more movement in the city, a lot more freedom. And so writings go out, Anabaptists come in, and they move into Munster in greater and greater degrees. And one of the really honestly lunatics of the revolution here was a man, at least originally, named John Mathis. And I'm sort of sad we don't have as much time to talk about some of these figures as I wanted to, because if you need to just go home and kind of look up the rebellion in Munster, and it's just sort of a display of the reality of human depravity. It's sort of like a Lord of the Flies example as to what takes place here. So this figure, John Mathis, and described as a creepy individual, even physically from the writings about this man, looked like something of, as James White describes him, as a Saruman of figures from Lord of the Rings. John Mathis essentially believes he's receiving prophetic words from God. He has a follower named John of Leyden who's going to also help in the takeover. John Mathis taught that the kingdom is going to be won by force. Essentially, John Mathis, this crazy individual, comes in and he starts preaching out in the streets about everybody needing to be baptized. There are thousands of people that end up being baptized in the public square. You start to see the people starting to realize something is taking place. The civil magistrates, the mayors are starting, actually, some Anabaptists are taking over in these positions. And people know something's coming, a revolution's coming. So everybody is actually stockpiling goods, because they know the bishop, and we just don't have the time to get into it, but the bishop at that time, who is very actually charitable to the Reformation. He is the civil magistrate of the city of Munster. He oversees that city. And so they know it's only a matter of time before this movement pushes the bishop out and they take over the city by force. And that's exactly what takes place. Eventually, the movement gains enough traction under John Mathis, and they expel the Catholics from the city of Munster as infidels, as wicked people. They expel many reformers as well, many Protestants who aren't affirming of the movement. They force more and more baptisms to take place. So the bishop is forced to leave, and the bishop mounts mass forces to come and lay siege of the city on the outside of the walls. Now, Munster is surrounded by an incredible wall, an incredible fortress. They are not going to get in easily. But what's very interesting is in a matter of time, the city under John Mathis, this man who is actually receiving in many ways similar revelations to the prophet Muhammad, very, convulsing sort of revelations from God where he goes into a trance and he says, the Lord is telling me this and we need to do that. People lose their minds in a very short period of time. The siege outside the city walls by the bishop who are trying to get in. At nighttime, some of these soldiers, these are just merchants, these are just regular individuals who yesterday were a very civil society, but are sneaking out of the city at night. And they're cutting the throats of soldiers because they know the area so well. They're taking out many of the men outside of the city walls under the control of the bishop. He's not a military man, but he's leading these forces. And so you can see also, under the power of John Mathis, just incredibly crazy things. At one point, I'm trying to remember all the different stories, but John Mathis just gets wind of who he thinks are dissenters of his power. A blacksmith, I can't remember his name, but he believes that God is giving him visions and revelations about rising opposition of the devil in the midst of Munster, and so brings this man before him and say, this man is creating sedition and we need to do something about this. But no one's really willing. They're kind of scared. He's getting the advice of others saying, look, we can't just enact our own judgment. We can't just take over. But John of Leyden, his predecessor, a young man who's known to be a very handsome and persuasive individual who was an actor, actually takes a sword and runs this man through in the midst of this sort of odd, very creepy area of judgment. He falls down, he doesn't die, and John of Leyden takes a pistol and shoots him in the head, essentially signaling, look, the Lord is enacting his judgment through John of Mathis, and we are taking over, and this is exactly what's going to happen. Unfortunately, that blacksmith, it took him 8 days to die. But this terrifies many of the inhabitants who originally resisted the by force baptism. Now there are hundreds on the basis of this event, of the execution of this blacksmith, come crying and weeping and saying, we want to be baptized. And these men are expert manipulators in sin. Because at that point it said that John Mathis actually kneeled down beside all the weeping, crying people that are wanting to be baptized because they know they'll otherwise be killed. And he's saying, oh, thank you, Lord, for giving me the opportunity to grant mercy to these individuals. And so it's just, it's such a wicked abuse of power. And John of Mathis, his reign of terror really would not last very long, because John of Mathis would, at a wedding, receive a revelation of God. He would go into a trance, he'd fall down on the table, and then wake up and walk out. Nobody would know where he was going or what he was doing. He would take a band of, I believe, 12 soldiers, march right outside of the city, and believe that he was going to fight and win in battle against the bishop and his 800-plus army. They are killed very quickly. They are slaughtered right out. And John Mathis, he's cut into many pieces. He's tortured before his death. They actually stick his head on a spike outside of the wall. They nail his private parts to the wall of the actual city of Munster, just declaring their victory. And unfortunately, at this point, the bishop would have an opportunity to take over the city. But not being a man of military power, doesn't take advantage of this. John of Leyden, his predecessor, the younger, early 20s man who's an attractive man, individual with much persuasiveness and an actor, takes the opportunity to declare his own kingship alongside of another goldsmith in the city, who they set up this sort of interesting interaction where John of Leyden declares that John of Mathis was wrong. He believed he was going to be resurrected, but he should have went into battle all by himself. And so as a result, God struck him down. But in the midst of that, declares his humility that he believes he should become a leader. And what do you know? Likely paid off. This goldsmith declares that he has a vision from God, that John of Leyden is the new king of David, and pulls out of his bag a golden scepter and a crown. And John Leyden accepts this, duty very humbly. And everyone's sort of, oh my word, what is going on? If there's anybody with any sanity left, they realize this is insane. And as a result of John of Leyden taking on the kingship of the city, immediately even overt, far worse areas of tyranny take place. Beheadings happen on a daily basis under John of Leyden, who enacts what we would know as basically communist tyranny in its worst form. In his fear of any sedition among the members of the city of Munster, he declares that it is legal, that you must keep your doors unlocked. Anyone can enter your house at any time. If there's any worry or thinking that you have a word against the king, well, we can enter in on any basis. And people are brought before his judgment on a daily basis, and he enacts the death penalty frequently, even for some matters of marital affairs, when a husband didn't believe in some cases that his wife was giving him his conjugal rights, she would end up being beheaded publicly in the sphere for her sedition to her marriage. It's an awful, awful situation. And the only reason that the rebellion went on for about a year is because they're quite defended. They have lots of resources. They do continue to get closer and closer to starvation. They actually end up eating each other at some point. But because of the fortress, the city, it's very difficult for the bishop to enter in. Even when he blows holes in the walls, they're very quick to patch it up. These people know the city very well. When people try to sneak in, they know where it is, and they sneak out and kill some of the soldiers. The bishop is having a difficulty getting headway. And many of his mercenaries are drunkards. They can't seem to enter into the city. There's more stories than I can actually share in the last 5 minutes. But nonetheless, John of Leyden enacts his tyranny. He makes it mandatory for all the remaining women, because many men did escape the city. He makes it mandatory for all unmarried women to enter into a marriage relationship. And he says that because of the patriarchy of the Old Testament, it is now legal to have polygamous relationships in a family. And he himself takes on, I believe, 16 brides. He adopted the widow of John of Mathis, who was killed outside the city gate before that. Just an awful, awful situation. And at one point, we don't have the time again to get into the story, he takes a very young bride from a situation between a family members' dispute, and she becomes his most favorite wife. But later, in her charity for seeing the people suffering in the city and what he believed to be coming against his power and trying to feed people and trying to get people out of the city, he will take his quote-unquote favorite and youthful wife into the city square and behead her publicly before all other people and force his other wives to dance around her body and sing hymns. Do you have go ahead, Chris.
He beheaded her himself.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, he took the sword from the executioner and beheaded her himself.
So, yes.
And then he had his wives dance around her dead body.
So if you didn't hear Chris, it's just a massive display of awful injustice, disgusting depravity. And at this point, the city is rising in its tension. People realize this is out of control. Absolutely out of control. There's more and more attempts, and some more successful attempts from those within the city who were sent out as apostles, who trick John of Leyden and give information to the bishop and his army, who will eventually, and time is failing us to explain all the stories, who will eventually sneak in and invade within areas of the city and take over and call in their troops to come within because they couldn't break down the city walls. They will enter in and they command, essentially, don't take the lead, don't kill the leaders. Don't kill John of Leyden, don't kill his other leaders. We need to execute them publicly. And what's very interesting is the rebellion ends and the soldiers come in and wipe them out. And John of Leyden and his other men are captured. Is just obviously just how easily and swift it is at that point. People are starving to death. It couldn't continue. The king and his 2 lieutenants are captured. They are tortured in very horrendous ways, and I don't need to get into the details today, but the king and his 2 lieutenants are captured, tortured, and executed, and their bodies, their corpses, are put in cages that are hung up from St. Lambert's in Munster, a cathedral there, and to this day, those cages still hang on that cathedral. And what's interesting, they were taken down during World War II. Damage came and the cages came down. The bodies were already long since rotted, but they voted to put the cages back up. And even recently, there was a referendum in Munster that said, well, should we take those cages down? It's a little bit morbid. And the Secular Society of Munster voted keep them up because of the tragic history of the rebellion at Munster under the Anabaptist movement. And they're still there today. You can look it up on Google Maps. So I want to quickly wrap up. That's obviously the evil excesses of the abuses of this movement that took place at Munster and the Munster Rebellion. But quickly, there was still some later Anabaptists that did thrive, and names that we will know. Obviously, as a result of the rebellion at Munster, the persecution even ramps up because essentially everybody in Roman Catholicism and Protestantism says, look, this is what happens with Anabaptism. This is the end of these people who are revolutionists and they destroy society and they're killing citizens and enacting their tyranny. This is what happens, and so we need to stamp them out, which they continue to seek to do. And one of the principal figures that does survive and the movement does continue in some ways was a man named Menno Simons. And Menno Simons reconsidered infant baptism by the martyrdom of an Anabaptist in 1531. He left his position as a parish priest in 1536, so around those who are surviving Anabaptists. That was right around the time when John of Leyden was actually executed. And Menno Simons would join a Dutch Anabaptist fellowship, and the followers of Menno Simons and his particular convictions in Anabaptism would be called Mennonites. And so this is where Mennonites come from. They would suffer similar persecution. Menno Simons would survive. He would preach in Holland and in Germany, encouraging his followers. He wrote the Foundations of the Christian Doctrine in 1539 and would articulate many of the earlier Anabaptist convictions, although a little bit furthering some of those convictions as well, with a special emphasis on pacifism and communalism. They were considered subversive by many governments, again, because of no service in the military, no taking of oaths. They were scattered throughout Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia, trying to get away from some of that persecution. And they would leave for America, where they were offered a degree of tolerance. But difficulties would still ensue there, as they were required to serve in armed forces. That would later be waived, so they would be allowed not to serve. But some of them would move then to South America as well. So that's where you have the branch of the old, still the remaining, probably the most thriving. I know there's Amish as well, but remaining branch of old Anabaptism movement there. So we're a few minutes past. I've got to end. We're at the end of class. I'd love to take questions. We just don't have the time. So let's close in a word of prayer. If you have any other questions about the Anabaptist movement, let me know. And next week we'll look at the well-known and certainly a favorite of many of ours, John Calvin, Reformed.